Brazil. You are my people. I feel as though I am at home. So thank you for the invitation. What I'd like to do today is talk to you about the book as it relates to this very important issue that is relevant for not only Brazilians, but people around the world. In doing so, in talking about my book, it's a relatively complicated story. It's difficult because there are multiple domains in the book. It's a memoir, it's a personal story, it's a science book, it's a policy book. It's difficult to combine all of those things in a 30-minute talk. I don't want to keep you here for 4 hours, so I'm going to try and do this in 30 minutes. So in order to do that, I have to tell you something about me. I want you to know that I grew up in the hood. I think you all call it favelas. That's where I'm from. And I was on my way to prison for an early death, just like many of the people in your favelas. And when I say that, I want you to understand that as a youth, as a young person, I engaged in some behaviors that I am not proud of today. I was a criminal, I did petty crimes, I sold drugs, I used drugs. I tell you this story so you know how far I have come from that area to now being the first African-American tenured professor at Columbia University. I tell you that story not so you can think of me as an exception. I am not an exception. People in those situations also can be successful. But the society has to make a decision whether or not they think those people are worth the investment. Our society in the United States has decided, for the most part, that those people are not worth the investment at this moment. Because there were some programs that were in place when I was a young person that are no longer available. There were some government programs, government assistance programs that help poor people like my family, help us move into mainstream. Those programs have been cut, beginning with our President Ronald Reagan, and continues today. And so the question before you all is, do you care about the poor people in this community, the poor people of Brazil? Because if you do, there are some things that you can do that help people have better lives. There are some things that you can do in order to help people be taxpayers, help people contribute to your economy. And this has been shown in science over and over and over. We all know this. And so part of my story is just that. But I won't share all of that story with you because I like to talk about drugs. I just will say this. One of the things that happened to me is that I was allowed, by going into the U.S. military ultimately, to get a college education. And most of my college education occurred outside of the United States. It occurred in the UK, in Britain. And it was a good thing that it occurred in Britain because the British were not embarrassed. They were not shy. They were not bashful about criticizing American racism or U.S. racism. And so it really helped me to understand what was happening in my society. Because in my society, they were telling me that everything was level, the playing field was level, that everything's fair. Racial discrimination didn't exist. But when I went to Britain, I learned quite a bit about American society that corroborated my reality. And it allowed me to get an education. And as my favorite writer has once said, James Baldwin is my favorite writer, and he has once said, the paradox of education is precisely this. That as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated. I hope today that we have some conscious people. I hope today that people in the audience will begin to examine the society in which you you are living, in which you are being educated. Once I started to do this, I had to start thinking about what kind of person I wanted to be. How could I contribute to my society? How could I help people who came up in the conditions under which I came up? People from poor areas. How could I contribute? And one of the things I decided to do was to study drugs, because I thought drugs was destroying my community. I thought drugs was the problem, the major problem faced by poor people. If we solve the drug problem, we're talking about 1985, 86. In the United States, crack cocaine was the major problem. At least we were told it was the major problem facing poor people. And I believed that. And so one of the things I thought I could do was to study drugs. And if I studied drugs, I could help solve the problem of poor people, the people I cared about. But something happened along the way. Something very important happened along the way. I discovered some things that challenged my thinking about that simplistic view. That view that drugs was the main problem destroying poor communities. A number of things happened along the way. I had some things that challenged my thinking as I started to study drugs. It has now been about 24 years I've been studying drugs. And I have given, personally, in research studies, I have given thousands of doses of crack cocaine to research participants and carefully studied their behaviors. And in the process, I actually got an education. I learned some things that challenged my thinking. One of the major things that challenged my thinking was that I thought crack cocaine was a different drug than powder cocaine. Turns out they're the same drug. Crack cocaine and powder cocaine are the same drug. I didn't know this because in my country, one of the things we did in 1986 was that we punished offenses related to crack cocaine 100 times more harshly than offenses related to powder cocaine. So we required people to go to jail for a mandatory amount of time, 5 years for a small amount of crack cocaine, where we didn't do the same thing for powder cocaine because we treated them like they were different drugs. But then I discovered that they were the same drug. This is a picture, a chemical structure of crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Powder cocaine is on your left, and crack cocaine is on your right. The only difference is in the red. On the left, focus your attention on the left, on the red circle. That's called the hydrochloride group. That is a salt. It has no biological activity on the brain. It contributes nothing to the pharmacology of cocaine. The only reason it's there is to keep the cocaine base, the remainder part of the structure, stable. That means that you can't smoke it when it's in this form. If you want to smoke it, you have to remove that hydrochloride portion. And that's what you do with crack cocaine. But the effects are exactly the same. So when you inject powder cocaine into your veins and you smoke crack cocaine, it has exactly the same time course of effect, same effects, exactly the same effect. But we were told that they were different. And this sort of belief, this view, had consequences. The major consequences that I cared about at the time, this is a slide showing basically, in the United States, people who are arrested and prosecuted for crack cocaine are primarily black people. 85% of the people who were arrested for this drug in the entire country at the federal level were black. Even though the majority of the users of this drug are not black. The majority of the users of crack cocaine are white in the United States. That's not surprising. Black people only make up 12% of the population in the United States. White people make up nearly 70%. So it's not surprising. But when you look at who's in jail for crack cocaine, it's for black people. Another thing that challenged my thinking was the notion that one hit of crack cocaine, you're addicted for life. People told me that if you use crack cocaine once, you're addicted for life. And I believe that. After 20-something years of study, I'm here to tell you that if anybody ever tells you that there's one hit of something will make you addicted, that is a license to stop listening. Because the person who's talking to you thinks that you're an idiot. There is nothing in life that you do once and you become addicted. Addiction, by definition, means that it requires work and multiple engagements with the subject. When we think about the one hit and you're addicted, we have examples of crack cocaine, for example, from all over the world of people who use crack cocaine. They go to work, they pay their taxes, and they are sometimes even elected as officials. So this is a picture of Rob Ford, the mayor of Toronto, Canada. He came out and admitted that he was using crack cocaine. He has recently gone to drug treatment, not for crack cocaine, but for alcohol. And people know that that was his major problem. The point here is not to make fun of Rob Ford. The point here is not to say that you should smoke crack cocaine and then you can become mayor. That's not the point. The point here is that this is the typical crack cocaine user. Someone like Rob Ford, who goes to work, pays their taxes, responsible person in his society. Some people think that he is a jerk, but they thought that long before he was using crack cocaine. And that has little to do with his crack cocaine use. And not only with crack cocaine, many people think that drug users in general, users of drugs like marijuana, users of drugs, you name the drug, methamphetamine now in our country, heroin in other countries. I understand that heroin is not a big deal here, but people think that folks, the majority of people who use those drugs are addicted. That's simply not true. The majority of people who use all of these drugs are more like these guys. These are the last 3 presidents of the United States. They all reported drug use. Barack Obama, our current president, reported using cocaine and marijuana. And if you read his book, he used cocaine several times. Not one time, not just dabbing, he used it several times. George Bush used marijuana. He's widely suspected of having used cocaine as well. Of course, Bill Clinton used marijuana, and he said that he didn't inhale and used it on limited occasions, right? If you believe that, I have some land to sell you in some of the favelas. So the point here is not, again, to besmirch the reputation of these guys. These guys all made important contributions to their country. These guys all are considered a success. The point is that you can use drugs and still be productive members of your society. The point is that the drugs are not the thing that is destroying people, as evidenced by the fact that more than 80% of all drug users use drugs with no problem. They go to work, they pay their taxes. Another myth that challenged my thinking was related to this notion that crack cocaine addicts could not respond to anything other than another hit of crack cocaine. So one of the things that I did in my research is that I did a study based on information from what we learned in animal studies. We learned from animal studies that if you allow an animal to self-administer, to give themselves intravenous injections of a drug like cocaine or amphetamine, those animals will take the drug until they die. We've learned that from some experiments. But as you look at the experiments more closely,
one of the things that you'll see is that the animal had nothing in the cage besides the lever to press for another hit of drug. The only thing they had access to was the drug. If you only had access to the drug and nothing else, I assure you, you will take the drug as well. And you will probably take it until death. But when you allow the animal alternatives, other things other than the drugs, sweet treats, a sexually receptive mate, banana chips, an exercise wheel, a number of other alternatives, the animals don't take the drug until death. In fact, they engage in those other behaviors. So we thought it would be interesting to do a study with crack cocaine addicts, bring them into the lab, and provide alternatives to them, and give them a choice between alternatives and crack cocaine. What we found was that when we provided alternatives as low as $5, a small amount of money, we could get them to choose the money on about half of the occasions. It told us that these crack cocaine addicts were also behaving rational, behaving just like you would predict if you provide alternatives, attractive alternatives. People take those attractive alternatives. Now, some of these findings, when we think about crack cocaine in the United States, they've now been moved or extended to methamphetamine. And we have been in part using science to perpetuate our myths and views about these drugs. So this is a picture, a brain imaging picture. If you focus your attention on the left, that is considered a normal brain. And then if you focus your attention on the right, that's considered a methamphetamine brain. When we put these pictures up to an audience like you, who are not neuroscientists for the most part, you think this tells you something. It doesn't. It shows you a pretty picture. If I take the left side of the room, image their brains, and compare it to the right side of the room and image their brains, I can find some differences too. And I can say incredible things about those differences. They may not be true, but I can say it. And recently I published a paper, a scientific paper, carefully critiquing the scientific literature in this area, the brain literature in this area, to determine what were the real effects. What I concluded was that scientists have greatly exaggerated the meaning of those differences that you may see. The differences do not predict anything about the functioning of the person who's being imaged. So, one of the things you like to see, if you see differences in the brain, you like to see that there is a difference in some behavior, some cognitive function, some other important behavior. You don't. And so those differences, we don't know what they mean. There are differences in all of our brains. For example, men have greater gray matter, greater amounts of cell density in some regions of their brain than women. But nobody's going around saying that women are cognitively impaired. Well, most people are not. No one is making a big deal of that. But we make a big deal when we see these differences when we image the brains of drug users. Even though their behavior, their cognitive functioning is intact. And so that's what this paper did. This paper systematically tried to make sure that the scientific literature, the interpretations in the scientific literature, were more consistent with the actual data. I did another study with methamphetamine users. I wanted to extend the study that I did with the crack users. I wanted to give more money than $5 to see what would happen. And I wanted to see if the methamphetamine users were behaving rationally because in the literature, it said that they were cognitively impaired. Today in the United States, people think of the methamphetamine users worse than they think of crack cocaine users. So in this study,
If you focus your attention on the red bar, that's a nice dose of methamphetamine. We gave methamphetamine, a large dose of methamphetamine, we gave them a choice. You can take methamphetamine or have nothing. So you have either drug or nothing. And over here are the number of opportunities that they had. They had 10 opportunities. We asked them 10 times. Methamphetamine or nothing. Methamphetamine or nothing. If you have no choice, you have nothing, what would you do? You take the methamphetamine. What happens when you allow them to take the drugs for $5? Well, you see that now they take the drugs on about half of the occasions. Right? But what happens when you offer them $20 for methamphetamine? What happens then? Well, they never take the drug. They take the $20. Right? Some people have said, well, they took the $20 from you so they could buy the drug when they leave the laboratory. Let's say they did that. That means that at least they had the ability to engage in long-term planning. They could exercise executive cognitive function. But I know many of them did not do that because instead of getting money for their participation, they asked me to write checks for various bills that they had. They had to pay certain light bills and those sorts of things. And so I paid that with their study earnings rather than giving them the study earnings. So the point here is that many of the myths related to crack cocaine, methamphetamine, just simply not supported by the scientific evidence. There's also this notion that some societies have. In the 1980s in our country, one of the things that we said was that we actually passed legislation entitled A Drug-Free America, Drug-Free Community. Does that sound ridiculous to anyone? There has never been